Loki is bad. Season 1, Episode 2, the character destruction continues. The supposed big reveal in this episode is that the other version of Loki that they're trying to track down is actually a woman. Which, of course, everyone already knew because there was a female actor specifically cast to be a female version of Loki for this series. And while it wasn't in any of the trailers, Disney was trying to play it up prior to the release of the series with articles and interviews and all that sort of stuff. So this episode treating it like it's some sort of big twist is just really stupid. This reminds me of a dumb trend that movie trailers tend to do, where they give away the entire plot in the trailer so that when you watch the movie, there's really nothing to be surprised about. So everyone knew that this other version of Loki was going to be a woman, and the surprise was completely ruined by Disney ahead of time because they wanted to score some woke points by virtue signaling as much as they could prior to the release of the series.
Yes. Queen what?
Also, I feel the need to point out that this actress looks absolutely nothing like Tom Hiddleston in any way, shape, form, or fashion. I realize that this is an alternate timeline version of Loki and there are going to be some differences, but seriously, Disney, you couldn't find an actress that had even a passing resemblance to Tom Hiddleston? And also, why is her hair blonde? You couldn't get an actress that had dark hair, or you couldn't buy a wig, or even some hair dye to make her hair black to match the character that she's supposed to be portraying? When you look at this character, she looks absolutely nothing like Loki at all. If you remove the stupid costume, then you wouldn't even know that it was an alternate version of Loki. She could have just stayed in the warehouse wearing normal clothes, and they would have never found her because she doesn't look anything like Loki. Disney and Marvel were so focused on the genitals that they managed to screw up absolutely everything else. Speaking of woke garbage, during the episode it was said repeatedly by numerous characters that the other version of Loki is the superior version. Just in case the misandry wasn't obvious enough, they wanted to constantly remind you that the female diversity higher version of Loki is of course smarter, stronger, and better in every way. Isn't that just stunning and brave? And the cherry on top of this turd sandwich is the entire episode, the main version of Loki is trying to convince everyone else that he is in fact the superior version, and they all just laugh at him and treat him like a buffoon. This is basic bitch woke writing 101, where the straight white guy thinks he's better than he actually is sort of thing. It's pathetic, it's obvious, and it's also quite bigoted, but you know, it's the good kind.
Your booze mean nothing. I've seen what makes you cheer.
As for the show, it's very obvious they're doing the same thing that happened in WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where large parts of the episodes are essentially just filler, extra scenes that don't add anything, or other scenes that get stretched out far beyond what's necessary. What should only take 20 or 30 seconds gets dragged out to 3 to 5 minutes, and usually it's very awkward with a bunch of bad jokes that simply fall flat. It's pretty obvious what's happening here. The writers at Disney just don't know what they're doing. They're trying to take a movie that should probably be about 2 hours long and stretch it out to a season of a TV show that would be 6 to 8 episodes. And it just doesn't work, and they don't know how to fill all the extra gaps. So what they do is they just stretch out scenes. You have places where characters are just walking from one spot to another. You have these extended shots where nothing is happening. You're just seeing, the camera pan across a large room or something like that. And all of this is just meant to take up space, to take up time during the episode, and that's it. Something else worth mentioning about this series is that the show creators have genuine contempt for the previous 10 years of the MCU and just really don't care about any of it.
There's 10 years of history that have come before this and everything. There's so much weight and everything on stuff like the Infinity Stones and everything. And what I thought and what our writing team really got excited about was, all right, how can we say that stuff is basically just bullshit?
What can I say except...
That's very disappointing.
Now, about a quarter way through this episode, a bunch of things all fell into place, and now I'm fairly certain I know how the series is going to end and what kind of an impact it's going to have on the rest of the MCU going forward, and I'll talk about that at the end of the video. This episode begins in the year 1985 at a festival in Wisconsin. Diversity Hire Loki has created a Nexus event and tricks the TVA into investigating, and of course, they all get ambushed. All of them are killed except for one who's taken over by a mind-controlled charm spell of some kind, and another one of those reset charges gets stolen. I can't help but notice that despite the TVA being an all-powerful organization, it's run by someone who is a complete moron who keeps making the same mistakes again and again, sending in small groups of people to investigate these Nexus events, where they end up getting ambushed and dozens of these time cops get killed and the reset charges get stolen. So either this idiot leader is doing this on purpose because she's evil, or she is just utterly incompetent. Honestly, it's a little bit funny because the woke weirdo writers insist that only women are allowed to be in positions of authority, but when they put them there, they fuck everything up. It's almost as if you should hire people based on merit and not some woke weirdo quota. So Mobius, Loki, and yet another small group of time cops are sent in to investigate because it worked out so well last time. We learn that the TVA is not able to go back in time just prior to the incident because the Nexus event will destabilize the timeline and prevent it. But for some reason, they can still go into the timeline after the incident, even though the timeline has been destabilized, which really doesn't make any sense. And really, the entire explanation is nothing more than just word salad created by the writers, who painted themselves into a corner and couldn't come up with a better idea. It's absurd that the TVA, an organization more powerful than all of the Infinity Stones combined, has the absolute control over time travel, is not able to go back an extra 10 minutes. It's just stupid.
Most illogical.
There's also a brief discussion about the reset charges, which is good because the audience was a little confused about whether or not the reset charge was resetting a timeline or if it was actually destroying it and killing everybody inside of it. And Mobius confirms, once again, that the reset charges are, in fact, annihilating everything, which means that the TVA is killing entire timelines and all of the people inside them every single time they use one of these reset charges.
Which, by the way, sounds like a nice way of saying disintegrate everything in its vicinity. He's on it.
Tell me, how are these not the bad guys again? Anyways, the group investigates the crime scene and Loki gives a big speech that is drawn out for way too long about how it's probably a trap, but the others ignore him and nothing happens. So Loki just ends up looking like a buffoon again. Unfortunately, we then have to see Rachel again. Mobius goes into her office and she has the audacity to berate him about the mission failure. Hold on a second. The only reason why Mobius even had to go and investigate that scene was because Rachel is a fucking idiot who keeps sending in the same small group of time cops in order to investigate these Nexus events, where they get ambushed by the diversity hire. So if Rachel wasn't a complete fucking moron and she had actually done her job competently, then the time cops wouldn't be getting killed in the first place.
That's pitiful. I mean, it's absolutely pitiful.
As I mentioned earlier, it's a hallmark of woke writing where they insist on putting the female character in charge. But the funny thing about this is every single time they do this nonsense, they try to make the female boss character as commanding and authoritative, but it just never works because the character is always utterly incompetent and comes off as just being snotty, arrogant, and an unlikable bitch, and that's exactly what Rachel is.
Congratulations. You're a failure.
Regardless of that stupidity, this is the scene where I was able to figure out what's going to happen with the rest of the series and the MCU going forward, and again, I'll talk about that later. So now, Mobius is upset with Loki and spends several minutes insulting him, treating him like a buffoon, and saying that the other version of Loki is superior. And then he brings him to a library where we get some painfully unfunny, drawn-out scenes of Loki interacting with stereotypical librarians. This completely falls flat, none of it is funny, and it's just a massive waste of time. Like, several minutes of the show is wasted on this garbage. During his research, Loki is able to figure out that apocalypse-level events result in zero variance energy, and he explains this to Mobius in yet another needlessly dragged-out scene that could have taken 30 seconds, but they decided to spend over 3 minutes on it. Essentially, apocalypse-level events result in massive destruction of everything and everyone in the area, and that means that if you travel back in time just before the event happens, nothing you do will cause a branching timeline because everything in that area is going to be destroyed anyways. So Mobius and Loki travel back to Pompeii, Italy before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in order to test this theory. Loki deliberately causes a scene, changing some of the events, but Mobius realizes that no branch timeline is being created because the event still has zero variance energy, thus proving Loki right, except this is a bunch of bullshit and it wouldn't actually work that way.
All right, explain this to me like I'm a 2-year-old, okay?
In the first episode, we're told that even the smallest, most mundane changes like showing up 10 minutes late for work will cause a branching timeline. But what the show is trying to tell us now is that you can go back before an apocalyptic event and do anything you want and absolutely nothing will change, and there will never be a branching timeline, which simply does not make any sense. Imagine if Loki had brought back a piece of radioactive material and put it on the ground before the eruption. Sure, the area would be destroyed, but it wouldn't matter because there would still be a lot of radiation and a branching timeline absolutely would be created. But it doesn't even have to be that drastic. The simple fact that these people are reacting to Loki and will now be in a different spot when they die will cause their skeletons to be discovered by archaeologists on a different day in a different place, which absolutely will cause branching timelines. Adding the element of time travel to a story is by far one of the hardest things to do in writing, and it takes a very talented writer to do it properly. Very clearly, the people at Disney do not have that talent.
I barely have a reason to care, and even I notice.
They have a hard time finding which event the diversity hire is hiding in because there are simply so many of these events throughout all of time. So they take a break and have a little chat where Mobius explains that the goal of the Timekeepers is to bring order to everything, and Loki argues that without free will and without chaos, life would just be boring. Loki asks how it will all end in the universe, and Mobius says that he doesn't know because the Timekeepers haven't finished writing the timeline. Which makes absolutely no sense, because if they have complete control over all of time, then how would they not be done yet? Regardless, Mobius suddenly remembers the candy that he stole from the girl at church. You know, the one that the TVA disintegrated. Anyways, he goes and finds the candy, and that it was manufactured for only a few years on Earth, and they figure out that the apocalypse event that they're looking for occurred during that time. So they narrow it down to a hurricane that happens in Alabama in the year 2050, and there's a warehouse with a massive amount of food and supplies that the diversity hire would be able to constantly reuse and never be discovered. So just to be clear, despite the near limitless number of these possible events throughout all of the universe and all of time, Loki and Mobius were able to discover the exact specific one where the diversity hire is hiding, because she decided to leave a piece of candy at a crime scene that she knew would be investigated by the TVA, where she knew the candy would be discovered. However, that candy can be linked to a very specific part of the Earth in only a few short years, where only one possible apocalyptic event would occur, thus leading the TVA exactly to where she is.
It's very convenient.
Very convenient.
So either 1, this is a trick and she had set it up the entire time, or 2, she is a complete idiot despite whatever the woke writers want us to believe. So one of those two things has got to be true, but we don't find out in this episode. We'll probably find out in the next one. So Mobius then has to go and beg Rachel in order to let him investigate, because he's just a dumb white guy and he's not allowed to make any decisions. So they take a whole bunch of the time cops, including Sassy Black Lady, and when they arrive on the scene, Sassy Black Lady immediately starts bossing around Mobius as well, because once more he's just a dumb white guy and he's not allowed to be in charge.
Moby, when it fits a woman.
So they go their separate ways. Mobius ends up discovering the time cop from the beginning of the episode who had been charmed, and that time cop reveals that she gave away the location of the Timekeepers, which puts them all in danger. Meanwhile, Loki had been forced to go with the Sassy Black Lady, but the Sassy Black Lady ends up getting mind control charmed as well. Loki has a conversation with the diversity hire where he reveals his big plan is to get in good with the TVA, eventually overthrow the Timekeepers, and then take over the entire organization. But this kind of seems like he's lying to me. Like, this doesn't seem like it's believable, and he's just kind of saying this stuff in order to trick the diversity hire. But the thing is, this is all ridiculous, because what the show is trying to do is turn this version of Loki into a full-on hero. But remember, in the course of the show and in the course of the MCU, not even 24 hours ago, this version of Loki had led the attack on Earth, killing thousands of people with the Chitauri army, and just was full-on evil. And now we're supposed to believe that because he watched some videos, some old home movies that were projected onto a wall, suddenly 24 hours have gone by and now he's a full-on good guy. It just seems all ridiculous. We'll probably find out whether he's telling the truth or lying later on in the series. However, Diversity Hire reveals that she doesn't want to control the TVA, instead she wants to destroy it. So she takes over the bodies of several other people and uses them to attack Loki. During this entire time and all of the fights, Loki not once uses any of his magic powers. We saw that he got them back because he left the TVA headquarters, and when he arrived at the scene, he used his magic in order to dry himself off from the rain, but during this fight, not once did he use any of his magic. Instead, he decides to fight with a vacuum cleaner.
this was just hilariously bad and pathetic.
But don't worry, it gets worse. Then we have the big reveal that the other Loki is a woman, and absolutely no one fucking cares. It's just awful. She only has one line of dialogue, and it's delivered in the most laughably bad way possible. I'm going to play it for you. You need to see this. This is so just absolute garbage.
This isn't about you.
You serious?
She must have gone to the Jodie Whittaker school of bad acting with how heavily exaggerated that was to the point of being cartoonish. Now, in fairness, maybe she'll do a better job in the rest of the episodes, but if we're gonna be honest, that was a pretty awful introduction to the character. Oddly enough, she does make a point, because even within his own show, Loki is being sidelined in favor of other, more diverse characters.
It is symbolic of our struggle against oppression.
Diversity Hire then activates all of the different reset charges that you initially might think would destroy the entire area, but instead, it opens gateways to different parts of the sacred timeline, and each one of them has a reset charge that goes through. In the TVA, we see that the sacred timeline is now being overwhelmed with all of the new Nexus events as a result of all those reset charges going off. Of course, none of this makes any sense whatsoever, because we've seen numerous times in the past that a reset charge will completely annihilate an entire timeline, and the fact that the Diversity Hire is sending dozens of these reset charges into the sacred timeline should mean that the entire sacred timeline gets completely and utterly annihilated, but instead it only has minor damage, which causes a couple of Nexus events. This is obviously inconsistent and done purely for the reason of pushing the plot forward, because the writers couldn't think of anything better. Diversity Hire then escapes through a portal and Loki chases after her, and that's the end of the episode. It was a good mix of boring and stupid, but if you recall earlier I mentioned I have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen at the end of the series, so here's the explanation on that. It's very likely that Diversity Hire is going to end up being a secret good guy, and that Rachel is going to end up being a secret bad guy. Earlier in the episode, when Mobius went to speak with Rachel, he talks about how she has a collection of all the different artifacts from the missions that he completed, but she says that she gets to keep them all because she's the boss. Regardless, she has Mobius sign some paperwork, and he notices that the pen she gave him is also one of these artifacts, but it's not from his missions. Instead, he mentions how this must be from one of her side missions that nobody else is allowed to know about. Also, at another point, Mobius tells Loki that he's never spoken to or even met the Timekeepers ever, and apparently the only one that's really able to get to speak to them is Rachel. And I can't help but think of this entire situation as being similar to The Wizard of Oz and The Man Behind the Curtain, where you discover that the super powerful beings that are supposedly in charge don't actually exist. Just because the characters existed in the comics doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to exist in the MCU. Or it's entirely possible that they did exist, but at this point in the story, they've already been dealt with behind the scenes, and we just don't know about it. Now, I don't think that it would have been Rachel that was capable of doing that, but in the comics, Rachel, or specifically the comic version Ramona Renslayer, was in a relationship with someone known as Kang the Conqueror. At other points, she was also his enemy. It kind of went back and forth depending on what the story was. Regardless, what the show is doing with Rachel is already pretty suspicious, and it might be that she is working with Kang the Conqueror already behind the scenes. Perhaps they are trying to take down the Timekeepers themselves, or they could have already done it. Maybe Kang the Conqueror is already in charge behind the scenes, and Rachel is just keeping up the appearances at the TVA. Rachel has made it very clear that the Timekeepers are watching the situation with the Diversity Hire very closely. Now, whether or not the Timekeepers exist, or whether it's Kang the Conqueror, or whatnot, who knows. But the fact of the matter is, Rachel is very involved with what the Diversity Hire is doing, and it's entirely possible that the Diversity Hire knows the truth about the Timekeepers, about Rachel, about Kang the Conqueror, and all of that sort of stuff. Which is how Diversity Hire becomes the secret good guy, and Rachel becomes the secret bad guy. By the end of the series, the sacred timeline is almost certainly going to be destroyed, possibly the Timekeepers along with it. I mean, the next Doctor Strange movie is called The Multiverse of Madness, so we kind of already know that the sacred timeline, the single timeline thing is gonna go away, and there's going to be a whole bunch of those doing all kinds of different stuff. Also, quick note about Kang the Conqueror, because he's probably the biggest time travel villain in all of Marvel Comics, he's accidentally created countless alternate versions of himself, and many of them will act differently from the original version. Sometimes he even has to fight himself. but this potentially gives the MCU a villain that could be used in many different ways in the different MCU movies. Whereas Thanos barely appeared at all until the very end, Kang the Conqueror could appear in a lot of those movies and have a much more active role, as defeating one of the versions of Kang the Conqueror doesn't affect any of the other versions. But honestly, none of that really matters, because as we've already seen, Phase 4 of the MCU is absolute garbage.